As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free.
It took a moment to sink in, but that message sure landed across Canada and maybe even in Washington, D.C. Tonight, Charles follows in his mother's long-ago footsteps and reads the speech from the throne.
If this doesn't get through to President Trump, I don't know what will.
Reaction from the Senate floor and beyond.
She may not remember this day, but we'll take lots of photos.
So just where are Canadians with their royal relationship?
We don't really need it anymore.
I think he's amazing.
And what about the man who invited Charles?
I won't look into his soul, but I think the president is recognizing, as others are, just how strong and free Canada is.
David Cochrane with Prime Minister Mark Carney.
From CBC News, this is The National in Ottawa with Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault.
Thank you for joining us. The King and Queen are back at home tonight after their two-day trip here to the nation's capital. Charles used his first Canadian visit as king to stoke the coals of Canadian pride with a royal message about Canada's sovereignty. Charles is just the second sitting monarch to open Canada's parliament, and many hoped that beyond symbolism, it might convince Donald Trump to drop his rhetoric about Canada becoming a 51st state. It didn't. As Ashley Burke shows us, despite a new offer from the U.S. president to join his country, today's throne speech essentially delivered Canada's answer in advance. No thanks.
A royal parade putting Canada's sovereignty on full display. The formality of this two-day visit all building up to the main event. The king entering the Senate to read the speech from the throne. A first for a monarch in nearly half a century. King Charles met by a chamber full of senators, former governors general, and past prime ministers, then opening his speech on a personal note.
Every time I come to Canada, a little more of Canada seeps into my bloodstream, and from there, straight to my heart.
In his own words, his own subtle way, the king affirming Canada's autonomy against a backdrop of American threats.
I've always had the greatest admiration for Canada's unique identity, which is recognized across the world for bravery and sacrifice in defense of national values.
The king ending by calling the country a force of good in the world.
As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free.
Everybody was applauding, and nobody was stopping. I thought we would have clapped in there for 5 minutes.
That's a powerful message, like I said, not only for our friends down south, but around the world.
It's a celebration of a history.
The history that sets Canada apart.
We are not Americans, and we don't feel we have to tell people that, but it was just very clear what is distinct about our national identity.
Then a few hours later, Trump revived his repeated taunt for the first time in weeks. Posting online, Canada can be part of his Golden Dome missile defense plan for free if it becomes our cherished 51st state.
We have an entire country that is making it clear to the U.S. that we are independent and free and not interested in being part of the United States. If this doesn't get through to President Trump, I don't know what will.
While the king's presence sent a message, the speech also laid out the government's priorities, including a middle-class tax cut, more housing, more spending on defense. But the Conservatives say the details are missing.
No specific plans to get anything done, even though, as the Prime Minister has said, we are in a crisis to break our dependence on the American economy.
So, Ashley, tonight the Prime Minister's office, as I understand it, is responding to Donald Trump's post.
Adrian, this is the first time since Mark Carney visited the White House that Trump publicly brought up Canada joining the U.S. And in a statement tonight, the Prime Minister's office said they've been clear with Trump that Canada will remain an independent nation and that Carney and his ministers are continuing to have wide-ranging talks with Washington, including on initiatives like the Golden Dome.
Okay, Ashley Burke, thank you, as always. Now, during the speech, King Charles recalled some of the major world events of the last 7 decades and said Canada is at another critical moment.
Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear, and ones which the government is determined to protect. The system of open global trade that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for Canadians for decades, is changing. Canada's relationships with partners are also changing.
He went on to say Canada is facing challenges, quote, unprecedented in our lifetimes. So that message about changing relationships, clearly a nod to the U.S. president. Chief political correspondent Rosemary Barton joins us now. So, Rosie, what stood out for you there?
Listen, Adrienne, in the excerpt you just heard, that was part of what the Prime Minister's office wrote and wanted the King to deliver. And in that way, it was an extraordinary moment for this country, for the King of Canada, someone who is not supposed to be political or partisan, to agree to lean into that language about Canada's sovereignty, identity, and values, and to repeat that line you saw off the top there, the true north, strong and free, knowing full well who the intended audience is. That was a very significant moment in this moment. And the King's introduction, written by the palace and him, did some of that too, recognizing Canadians have a new sense of patriotism. And whether you are a supporter of the Royals or not today, you were at very least reminded of Canada's history and traditions, and critically, Adrienne, its differences.
Absolutely. So the throne speech officially opened Parliament, but so much is coming next. What is next for the government?
Well, certainly no lowering of expectations. We didn't hear that today. In fact, quite the opposite. And we will see in short order some of that legislative agenda to put the action behind the words we heard today. The vote on the speech from the throne, which is the first confidence vote for the government, will take place next week on June 4th. And tomorrow, and this is an important milestone too, the Prime Minister will face another challenge, his very first question period.
All right. Thank you, Rosie. So Rosie will be back with the At Issue panel a little later with their takes on the substance of that speech and its message. But before that, we're going to hear quite a lot from the Prime Minister. Shortly after the throne speech, Mark Carney sat down with Power and Politics host David Cochrane, and we learned something about his defense strategy.
We're spending over 75 cents on every dollar of capital spend for defense goes to the United States. Right. That's not smart. What's better if we spend more at home, if we have diversified partnerships. Look, part of what's been happening in the last few months since I became Prime Minister is a number of conversations of increasing specificity with our major European partners so that we become defense partners with them.
So there's much more of that to come, but mercifully, here's David Cochrane to tell us what made news. So, David, a new deadline of sorts, right, for building ties to Europe on defense spending in particular.
Yeah, another big goal the Prime Minister has given himself until Canada Day to complete. He already wants to cut taxes, get rid of federal trade barriers within Canada, and now he wants some sort of a defense partnership with the European Union. You heard there him talking about 75 cents of every defense dollar goes to the United States. He's made it clear he wants to reduce Canada's reliance there, build defense industrial capacity here. Europe has a similar goal. And within a matter of weeks, he says, after meetings and summits in Europe, they should have some sort of a framework of a deal as Europe and Canada find ways to support each other as the U.S. becomes less reliable as a partner.
Indeed. And so Mark Carney gave another signal, right, that he wants government to get things moving.
Yeah, and watch out for next week. Mark Carney and the premiers are going to meet in Saskatoon for a First Ministers meeting. Build, build, build. He's talked about that a lot. Next week, it should move from promise to projects. The federal government, the provincial governments, industry, they've been building a list of projects that they see to be in the national interest, a short list that they want to fast track for approval to get moving at speed and scale. What the Prime Minister said today, what I heard from the Premier of Manitoba, Wab Kinew, yesterday, is that we'll get the first list of projects next week in Saskatoon, so moving from promise to project as fast as they can.
Okay, well, thank you. You've had a bit of a day.
Long day.
Thank you for that. That's David Cochrane. So you may have noticed the absence in the Senate of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The 91-year-old is said to be recovering well in hospital after a heart procedure to insert a stent. He is expected to return home very soon. Now, the royal visit had some political significance, obviously, but it was personal to individual Canadians. Rafi Boudjikanian shows us how the King and Queen made waves right here in Ottawa.
Hours before the King's appearance, the Keeners were already setting up.
I got here at 7:30 because I knew there would be a crowd. And as a proud monarchist, I'm very, very happy to be here and would always want to kind of get a front shot of the King.
Once the big moment arrived, the national capital was so crowded that few caught more than a glimpse of the royal couple, including this group who drove for hours.
It's just so exciting. Yeah. Been waiting a long time to see them in person. So we've gone to London a couple of times, but never got to see them anywhere.
A momentous occasion, even for those still new to the world.
I mean, you want your kids to be a part of history, right? And she may not remember this day, but we'll take lots of photos.
We gave away 500.
No pictures for these royal supporters, but they brought their own edible effigies.
I'm here because my mom, 95, she got out of bed and voted. She believes in Canada, in the freedom that we have.
But not everyone who showed up in Ottawa was as sweet on the royals.
In the name of standing up to Trump and the U.S., Carney is bringing a relic of feudalism, the monarchy, as a means to supposedly defend the sovereignty of Canada.
Pleasure to meet you, Charles. Still, lots of people here tried to shake the King and Queen's hands. Few succeeded.
Just amazing to see that they're here, that they came to Canada.
A trip that ended with this solemn moment, the crowd clearing for the King to lay a wreath at the National War Memorial.
And Adrian, the King has a personal connection to that monument. It was unveiled in 1939 by his grandfather, George VI, in what was the first visit to Canada by a reigning monarch.
Amazing. So, Rafi, we saw you right there, right outside the Senate when the King went by, when he shook all those hands. The Prime Minister as well. Can you take us there to that moment?
Yeah, he seemed very pleased with the throne speech. Mark Carney said it was a very Canadian moment. I pointed out to him the King spoke in both English and French, and then Prime Minister Carney sort of chuckled and said the King's French is very good, better than his, and then he even admitted for most people that is the case.
Absolutely, here too. All right, Rafi Boudjikanian, thank you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
that. So people who show up to see the royals at a public event are likely to be supporters of the monarchy. We asked Lindsay Duncombe to get a handle on overall opinion regarding the Crown and King Charles in particular.
At this Downton Abbey-themed floral exhibit,
we're going British style.
enthusiastic support for King Charles.
I'm proud and happy that he's here. He is showing the world that we're still united, we're connected.
Cornelia Van Keith woke up at 6 a.m. to watch the throne speech.
He is part of our heritage. I was impressed and moved by the fact that he was so inclusive, with respect to the First Nations, and he was speaking French.
Perhaps that's not surprising given the theme of this event, but recent polling shows the royal visit might not be everyone's cup of tea.
I don't particularly care for the monarchy. I feel like it's kind of outdated. We don't really need it anymore.
I mean, I didn't know there was a King of Canada.
Angus Reid Institute asked Canadians, what is your reaction to the King giving the throne speech? 83% said indifferent.
It's less that people are hostile and more that they've just got other things going on in their lives.
People who want to see Canada break from the monarchy say inviting the King decreases Canada's international clout.
I mean, we're telling Donald Trump, you're not the foreign billionaire who's our boss. This is the foreign billionaire who's our boss.
When it comes to Charles himself, though, there's some indication Canadians are warming up. A recent poll found 45% of Canadians had a positive or somewhat positive view of the King. That's up 8 points since he took the throne.
I think he's amazing. I think better than I thought he would be.
Exceeding expectations, then, at least for those paying attention to the pomp, ceremony, and circumstance. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Vancouver.
In the one-on-one interview with David Cochrane that we spoke of earlier, Mark Carney laid out his priorities and how he plans to achieve them.
We've got to get take-home pay up for Canadians. The first easiest way to do that is to cut taxes now.
The Prime Minister's take on affordability, housing, and much more next. Multiple wildfires are wreaking havoc in the prairies.
If the winds change, potentially there could be a total loss.
Why some of them are particularly challenging. And in Gaza, limited aid distribution causing chaos and prompting new criticism.
It is a distraction from what is actually needed.
We're back in 2.
All Canadians can give themselves far more than any foreign power on any continent can ever take away.
That is the King delivering the speech from the throne and urging Canadians to seize an opportunity for renewal in the face of a changing world. Now, shortly after that speech, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down for an extensive interview with David Cochrane, host of Power and Politics. David drilled down on government priorities. Here's some of that conversation.
Prime Minister Carney, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me, David.
I want to start, if I can, with a moment near the end of the speech that drew some sustained applause when the King said, as the anthem reminds us, the true north is indeed strong and free. Very subtle. Was that for a Canadian audience or for an American one?
Well, I think everything is for Canadians first and foremost. Speech from the throne for setting out a bold, ambitious plan for Canada, the government's plan. And I think a clear message there that we are strong, we are free, and it's time to reinforce those strengths and those freedoms.
How much progress do you think you've made since the Oval Office meeting with President Trump on resolving some of the issues around trade, in particular the sectoral tariffs?
Well, I would term it this way, since we're at historic moments, epoch-making, to quote the speech from the throne. So to be slightly Churchillian, it was the end of the beginning. The Oval Office was the end of the beginning, reestablishing sovereign-to-sovereign dialogue, much more constructive engagement on some of the big issues on both security and economics. We've had fairly intensive discussions since then. Minister LeBlanc, for example, and our ambassador were down for a number of meetings last week. Conversations continue. We've got more that we need to do before we're satisfied that we have a partnership that is in Canada's
But how would you characterize it? I mean, have you moved closer? I mean, he's going to be in Canada on around the 15th of June for the G7.
Yep.
Could you have a deal by then, a deal by Canada Day, or does this sort of thing that moves into maybe the Kuzma review time period, which Mexico is now saying could start in September?
I don't think it's in either of our nation's interest for it to drag out that long. I think the issues are getting a sharper relief. But we're going to take as much time as necessary to get the right deal for Canada, but no more.
On the relationship, though, overall, Prime Minister, I mean, there seems to have been progress on at least...
There is progress. Without question, there is progress, David.
For sure, but on the recognition of sovereignty, right? The president said he still likes the idea of the 51st state, but he's not going to talk about it. Ambassador Hoekstra
I like the idea of me
is
playing in the NHL, David, but
yeah, well,
it's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely fair. But he still talks about getting the auto sector. The president does. He still has the tariffs against the auto sector and talks about making it economically unviable to make cars in Canada and to move it to the United States. So the economic threat still persists.
I think the one of the issues for the United States and by extension for Canada is, can the U.S. auto sector be viable and truly competitive versus Asian competition, particularly coming Chinese competition, but broader global competition? Can it be viable if it's just an American auto sector, a U.S. auto sector? The answer is no. And Canadian, we have a great auto sector, a great auto parts sector, and that integration of the auto sector is part of what will make North America competitive, and that's what we're working towards.
A line you said with some frequency during the election was, he wants to break us so he can own us. Do you still believe that's true?
No, I think the president, I won't look into his soul, but I think the president is recognizing, as others are, just how strong and free Canada is. And so if you look at the speech from the throne today, as you did, This is about investing in Canada. This is about building Canada, about making one Canadian economy out of 13. It's about nation-building projects. Each of those and those together give us much, much more than could ever be taken away by trade action. This is a confident country moving forward, and it's an exciting time.
Okay, I want to dive into sort of the 7 priorities in your mandate letter. What appears to be a mission-driven approach to government, I would take from that. The list is limited, but each one of them is quite broad in terms of what fits in there. But I want to ask specifically about housing. Now, I know you said you don't want to force down the price of existing houses. You want to reduce the cost, increase the affordability of new builds with the GST cut at the front end, driving down development fees to make it more affordable while driving up wages. So buying power, it makes it easier to own a home.
Yeah.
So like a simple measure of that is the price to income ratio.
Yeah.
And over the last 20 years, that has just gotten impossibly unbearable in a lot of big markets. Like 20 years ago in Toronto, it was 5 to 6 times an average salary. Now it's like 11 to 12.
Yeah.
What sort of a ratio are you aiming for with this policy? What's an affordability standard?
Well, it comes into several things. Now you've asked a very complicated question and you've layered it down. And the bottom line is for Canadians, can I get a mortgage? Can I afford the mortgage payments and I can buy the house? Part of what's shifted is the length of those mortgages and the cost of those mortgages. So there's multiple factors that have to happen here. One is we've got to get take-home pay up for Canadians. The first easiest way to do that is to cut taxes now. We're cutting that middle-class tax cut. That's why that's the first thing we're doing. Cut taxes on first-time home buyers, younger Canadians. They're buying a new home, saving up to $50,000. In fact, in some markets, Toronto would be an example, more than $50,000 off the price of a home. That's all, the big money, obviously. Then we need to get supply up in order to get that. At the same time, and we have a very ambitious plan, you'll see that roll out more into the fall setting of Parliament for that to roll out, to get supply up, double the rate of home building, all while growing the economy, because what we need to see is incomes grow. So you combine all of that with mortgage terms, you've got to pull collectively, we've got to get those numbers back, those ratios you quoted, back towards those that you started with.
This is a medium term.
Of course,
this is like 5, 7, 8 years. Is that what we're talking about?
We're more ambitious than that, but you have years, not weeks. And you know what? One of the things that's going to characterize this government is being straight with people. Okay, there are things we can do in the short. First off, let's be straight. It's a sunny day. It's beautiful out there. We are in a crisis. We have to get moving. We have to get moving on these major projects. We have to get moving on building one Canadian economy. That is why the First Ministers, the Premiers, and myself are meeting next Sunday in Saskatoon, because we have to get moving. That's why a number of the Premiers are here in Ottawa today. That's why some of the Western Premiers have banded together on some big ideas that we're really looking forward to getting behind, and on and on. So we got to move, but the idea that, I'm not saying you suggested, that we can just snap our fingers and all of a sudden housing in this country, a housing crisis will be solved overnight. No, that's not going to happen, but that's not a reason to wait. We're going to get going.
I need to ask you about Alberta, and I need to ask you about the oil and gas sector. Because I know you said you want to create an energy superpower, clean and conventional energy. A pipeline is a possibility, but not a certainty. And Alberta would say 1 at minimum is what is needed, maybe 3 to the north, to the east, and to the west. This is what the Premier said. Is that a reasonable expectation for the Premier of Alberta? And the frustration over this, and you know as someone who grew up in Edmonton, it's driving a lot of the resentment to the national government of Alberta. So as Prime Minister, how do you confront that?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, let's recognize a few facts in terms of pipelines that have been built to Tidewater and projects opening up, whether it's TMX, whether it's Cedar LNG, and beyond. There's a series of LNG projects that more can be done, more should be done, and from our perspective, more will be done. So we will be moving through this process to make these types of projects possible. Now, we don't begin and end the conversation. It's remarkable in some circles, this conversation starts and ends with pipelines.
But that's what it's become politically, right?
No, it's not. No, that is not what it's become politically. That is not what it's become for Canada. Canada is a nation. Canadians want, yes, they want energy pipelines that make sense. They also want grid connections between our clean grids. They want actually less carbon. So they want carbon capture and storage pathways project to move forward. They want broader corridors, for example, Gray's Point in Nunavut, that open up whole swaths of the country to new trade. They want critical minerals so that we are sovereign in the most important components of the future. All of those things are possible. And the more we're doing more of them, the more likely this is going to succeed. That's why these meetings and this process is so important. That's why the legislation that we're putting forward, we will put forward in coming days, is so ambitious. We are in a crisis. We can control our destiny. We are a brave, bold, confident nation. We are the true north, strong and free. But freedom is something you earn every day.
You can find David's full interview with Mark Carney on the CBC News YouTube page. Multiple communities have been evacuated in the Prairies as wildfire season takes hold.
We have no air support or ground support at this time.
The growing calls to leave before it's too late. After the break, Rosie's here with a special edition of At Issue. Hello, you.
Hey, Adrian. Tonight, we're obviously going to talk more about the King's message to Canadians.
As the anthem reminds us, the true north is indeed strong and free.
So how significant was this speech in this critical moment in time, and did it deliver on what the government wanted? Chantal, Althea, and Andrew join me to talk about that and more. At Issue tonight, the King delivers the speech from the throne, a historic moment to deal with an unprecedented threat, with a message to Canadians about what that means for this country.
Today, Canada faces another critical moment. Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear, and ones which the government is determined to protect.
And in an exclusive interview on Power and Politics, the Prime Minister says the message is resonating.
I think the President is recognizing, as others are, just how strong and free Canada is. And so if you look at the speech from the throne today, as you did, this is about investing in Canada.
So what's to be made of the government's message on this day, and did the presence of the King do what the government hoped? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down on this Tuesday edition. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj. What did you make, Chantal, both of the presence of the King and the substance of the speech in terms of what it was intended to do?
Okay, the presence of the King, I think, helped focus minds on the speech, including Donald Trump's mind, apparently, which is always useful because throne speeches are not made to do, great news. But I also thought that what was more important, what actually spoke to Canada more, was the presence in that room of people who have just fought an election. People who were prime ministers and who were adversaries, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. No one sitting there is saying the result is unfair. It was a competitive election. No one sitting there is saying someone cheated. It was, we had an election and everyone who was a player showed up. And I thought that was just as important as having the King there.
We should say Donald Trump obviously has responded. Well, I don't know if he's responded to this, but he has mentioned the 51st state in a social media post for the first time since the Prime Minister was in the Oval Office. So if this speech was intended to get the President to stop talking, it didn't do that, but did it deliver on the other things that it was supposed to do, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on Chantal's point, nobody who's there wants to be one of the 51st state either.
Yeah, that's right.
So it showed unity in the face of this ridiculous nonsense coming from south of the border. But bringing the King into it, I thought, brought a certain gravitas as well. If you're going to assert your sovereignty, it's more than just, as Donald Trump likes to call it, a line on the map. It's several centuries of history. It's all of the constitutional development that goes with that. It's a tradition of democracy and civil liberties, et cetera, all of which are embodied in and symbolized by the crown, by the monarchy. So bringing the King in just gave it an extra heft and gave substance to our claims of sovereignty rather than just being, as I say, a place on the map.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by that too, Althea. Whether you liked the monarchy or not, it did remind you of the differences between Canada and the United States.
Of course. I think there was more symbolism than just giving a sense of pride, especially to English Canadians, when they see the King and our history and our shared history and kind of all this new patriotism that Canadians have felt since February. To build on, I'm not sure who it was who just said it, Andrew or Chantal, but even the Bloc Québécois actually came out and responded to the speech saying that there wasn't enough against Donald Trump in this speech. Like, they expected it to be tougher. They don't want to be part of the 51st state either. I do think, though, the part of the reset that this speech from the throne is intended to do is a clean break from the Trudeau era. Mark Carney wants to think of the Liberal Party starting a new Liberal term, not a fourth Liberal term. Right. And so having the King read the speech from the throne and not having the Governor General that Mr. Trudeau's appointed read the speech from the throne, I think is also part of that.
So let's talk about the sort of substantive part of the speech that the King had to read in terms of the government agenda. Was there anything notable there, Chantal, in terms of the ambition, level of ambition that this government continues to put forward?
It did mirror the mandate letters to ministers that we saw last week. And if you followed the election campaign, I don't think you had major surprises. But the devil is going to be in the details, and I think we will know a lot more about the ambitions of this government when we see the fine print of legislation on, for instance, so-called national projects of national interest, and how that works. The words, though, they jibed with, I think, what Canadians had heard over the course of the election campaign, which is always good. It's always good also. There wasn't a grocery list that went on forever with every single little item that the government may one day pay attention to. So that's where I'm still wondering, what did how many Secretary of States read into it, this mission statement?
Andrew.
It's sober, it's minimalist, it's just the priorities. It's also directed at two things. One is protecting Canada from Trump, so there's the things about trade and defense, et cetera, but also protecting the Liberals from the Conservatives. So a good part of this thing, it's all, as you say, it was all laid out during the election campaign, but it's all based on covering off the weaknesses that the Liberals have, that the Conservatives have been exploiting on immigration, on housing, on border security, on affordability, et cetera. And, you know, you could very well see a moderate Conservative government having brought in this throne speech.
Althea?
I agree. We just spoke about this a little bit earlier today, but this speech from the throne could easily have been brought in by Erin O'Toole, possibly even Stephen Harper. I don't think it's about protecting the Liberals' voter base from the Conservatives. I think it's frankly about courting the Conservatives in this speech. Sure. In fact, I wonder if New Democrats and Bloc supporters who voted for Mr. Carney this time felt like they saw themselves reflected in this speech. Because what happens in an election campaign, especially when you have leaders that speak in kind of vague terms, is people project what they think that candidate is going to do. Right. Yeah. And when you see it all laid out like that, you realize what the priorities are. And I thought, you know, aside from building Canada, which frankly is not a Donald Trump response, that is something Mr. Carney has been running on basically for the last year when he was a candidate in 2020, all the defense spending, the energy, that was a huge focus. You kind of wonder where are the other priorities fitting in that? I think that's a conversation that we're going to kind of, the seeds have been planted and we may see some sprouts in the few weeks.
Chantal.
Yes, but many NDP and Bloc voters voted not only because of Trump, but because they didn't want Pierre Poilievre.
Right.
Yes.
Statement, for instance, on Radio-Canada and CBC, you wouldn't have seen in a Conservative throne speech the statements about pursuing childcare, pharmacare, dental care, not expanding it, but pursuing it, you might not have seen. So I think there was enough there for, I don't believe NDP voters or Bloc voters voted for Mark Carney because they suddenly saw him as the new leftist leader.
Okay, and we'll talk more, of course, on Thursday. That is at issue for the King's speech from the throne. We will be back on Thursday. We'll talk about question period and other things. And with that, I'll throw things back to Adrian here in Ottawa.
Hey there, thanks, Rosie. New evidence has been released in the World Junior Sex Assault trial. The latest from court next.
This is corporate greed at its worst. And we're here to say enough is enough.
The Union for Hudson's Bay workers held rallies across Ontario today demanding protection for wages, benefits, and pensions. More than 8,000 jobs will be cut by Sunday. The company filed for creditor protection in March. Now, wildfires are threatening communities across the prairies tonight, forcing thousands of people to flee. Wide swaths of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are under an extreme fire danger warning. Warm, dry conditions are fueling several out-of-control wildfires, many in rural areas. Julia Wong explains how that is complicating efforts to fight back.
In northern Manitoba, a wildfire is threatening a remote community, and its deputy mayor says they're on their own.
We have no air support or ground support at this time.
About 70 residents were told to leave Monday. Roughly a dozen volunteer firefighters were left behind to defend Sheridan, roughly 900 kilometers northwest of Winnipeg.
If the winds change, potentially there could be a total loss.
Next door in Saskatchewan, crews are working furiously after two wildfires merged near the resort village of Candle Lake, about 220 kilometers northeast of Saskatoon. But patience is wearing thin. Community leaders want to clear a section of forest to protect the village, but provincial approval hasn't come down yet.
I need the funds, I need the manpower, I need the dozers, I need that fire break built.
And time could be running out. An evacuation order could happen at a moment's notice.
My understanding is if it gets within 15 kilometers is when we start to make those kinds of decisions. Currently, we've got about 5 or 6 kilometers.
In Alberta, about 1,300 people from Swan Hills, about 220 kilometers northwest of Edmonton, were told to go as flames crept closer.
It's hard. You think, okay, I've worked all my life to get this, and just praying and hoping that the good Lord is going to make sure that our home is safe.
This wildfire season tracks pretty close to normal, says this expert.
The actual forecast for the summer, which you have to take with a little bit of salt, is hot and dry, which means more fire. So I'm expecting a very busy fire season for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba.
And until there is major relief, there is little evacuees can do. Julia Wong, CBC News, Edmonton.
At the sexual assault trial of 5 former World Junior hockey players, the day was dominated by a police interview with one of the players. Katie Nicholson takes us through it.
I'm just going to adjust the camera a bit.
For the first time in this weeks-long trial, court heard from one of the accused.
She was kind of leading the way and kind of asking for it.
Michael McLeod's November 2018 interview with then London police detective Steve Newton.
She got on the bed naked and said, "Okay, who's going to have sex with me? Like, you guys are pussies. Like, none of you guys want to have sex with me."
McLeod and his former World Junior hockey teammates, Alex Fermenton, Carter Hart, Dylan Dubé, and Cal Foote, are all charged with sexually assaulting a woman in a London hotel room in June of 2018. All have pleaded not guilty. Court previously heard how after a consensual encounter between McLeod and the woman, known as EM, as many as 10 players came into the hotel room. Newton is heard off camera asking,
"Do you get the sense the guys are coming because they know there's a naked girl in the room who's doing sexual favors for people?" I mean, like, I don't know how guys kept showing up.
Newton prodded, saying everyone had phones. McLeod acknowledged there were probably messages about the girl in the room.
Were you sending her those messages? No, like I just told the guys I was getting food and there's a girl over. That's all I said to a few guys.
In the interview, McLeod didn't mention 2 texts he had sent teammates, which have been entered into evidence. One at 2:10 a.m. to the team chat. Who wants to be in a 3-way quick? 2:09, Mikey. At 2:15 a.m. to Taylor Radish. Come to my room if you want a gummer, a slang term for oral sex. Detective Newton really hasn't had a chance to testify. The videos have done all the talking, but he's expected to face questions about that interview and about the first investigation London police abandoned into the alleged assaults. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, London, Ontario.
The suspect in a car ramming incident in Liverpool is facing a series of charges tonight.
We have arrested a 53-year-old man from West Derby on suspicion of attempted murder, dangerous driving offences and driving whilst unfit through drugs.
50 people were injured, 11 remain in hospital after a car plowed into a crowd of soccer fans. Police believe the driver followed an ambulance when a barricade was temporarily removed. No word yet on a possible motive. In Gaza, desperate crowds rushed a food distribution site, scattering at the sound of gunfire. And as Sasha Petrusek explains, beyond the chaos, aid groups say the new Israel-backed humanitarian effort also falls far short of the need.
Thousands pushed past barriers as desperation soared. Palestinians rushing for food, aid allowed in by Israel after an almost 3-month blockade. I ran in so I could feed my children, he says, no matter the danger. The chaos overwhelmed American private contractors hired to provide security. They withdrew as shots rang out, some apparently injuring this man. Video gathered for CBC News by a freelance cameraman shows military helicopters firing something overhead. The novice group delivering aid says 8,000 boxes of food were distributed in southern Gaza, though none of the badly needed medical supplies or fuel. The organization was set up by Israel and the U.S. to bypass the UN's aid system, which Israel says was being hijacked by Hamas. The UN denies that, saying it is better prepared to feed Gaza. It calls the chaos heartbreaking.
It is a distraction from what is actually needed, which is a reopening of all the crossings.
Israel's Prime Minister brushed off difficulties at distribution hubs.
There was some loss of control momentarily. Happily, we brought it back under control.
But Israel's aid delivery is being called too little, too late. Germany's foreign minister says the humanitarian situation is intolerable and leveling a stark accusation against the Netanyahu government, a former Israeli prime minister.
The leading cabinet ministers that say we should starve Gaza. What is it if not a war crime?
Israel says this food delivery approach will continue. Sasha Petrusek, CBC News, Toronto.
King Charles is back in the UK after a brief but consequential visit to Ottawa.
Every time I come to Canada, a little more of Canada seeps into my bloodstream.
We'll take you through some of the highlights from this final day of his visit next. It's been a big day in Ottawa with moments of celebration, reflection, and promises for the future. Before we go tonight, let's take one final look at how this historic royal visit unfolded.
I wanted to be in the front row. I grew up with royalty, and I think it's very important that we keep our ties.
We're here to see the King and the Queen because we're proud Canadians.
I love that he has made that effort to come and be a face for us during, a tricky time.
This is my 20th visit to Canada, spread over the course of more than half a century, and my first as sovereign. As I've said before, every time I come to Canada, a little more of Canada seeps into my bloodstream, and from there, straight to my heart.
It's important that they're here to help us define what's unique about Canada, that we're connected.
As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free.
So I had the good fortune to be in the crowd today watching people watch the King. Canadians doing what Canadians do, like very respectful, protesters on one side, people singing God Save the King on the other, everyone making sure everyone else had water. It was a very Canadian kind of day. From all of us at The National, thank you for being with us. You can watch anywhere, anytime on the free CBC News app and subscribe to The National's YouTube channel. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. From all of us here in Ottawa and back at home in Toronto, take care.